My parents said you'll never measure up to your sister. Then she discovered what I'd been hiding. My name is Mara Whitfield. I am 34 years old. I was standing in the back office of Whitfield and Daughters Catering, the business I had run, for 10 years when my mother told me I was being replaced. You were always the backup, Mara, she said, not even looking up from her coffee. You'll never measure up to your sister. Renata is the face of this family. It's time you accepted that. My father nodded beside her, arms crossed, the way he always did when a decision had already been made without me in the room. Through the glass partition behind them, I could see my sister Renata laughing with a linen vendor, phone in one hand, our company card in the other. She didn't know that 6 years ago I had quietly started buying back the one thing that made this business mine to lose. She didn't know about the envelope sitting in my desk drawer, already notarized, already filed, with the county recorder. She was about to find out. If you have ever been told you don't measure up in your own family, stay with me to the end, because what happens next is going to feel like justice, and I want you to feel every second of it. With me. And if stories like this speak to something in you, hit subscribe now. Because this family is not finished yet. I need to take you back before I tell you what happened in that office, because you have to understand the pattern before you can understand why I finally broke it. I grew up in Millbrook, a small town built to around one main street and a lot of long memories. My parents, Douglas and Elaine Whitfield, opened a catering company out of our garage when I was 7 years old. Renata is 2 years older than me, and from the very beginning, she was the one my parents built their story around. I remember being 9, standing at the edge of the community hall in a paper apron, folding 200 napkins into swans because my mother said my hands were steadier than Renata's. Renata got to greet the guests. I got to fold the napkins. When the local paper did a feature on the Whitfield family of flavor, the photograph was my parents and Renata standing in front of a dessert table. I was the one who had baked the desserts. I was cropped out of the frame because, as my mother explained later, you don't really photograph well when you're nervous, sweetheart. I was 11. By the time I was 16, the pattern had a name in my head, even if I never said it out loud. Renata got the stage. I got the invoice. When Renata failed her driving test twice, my father spent a Saturday afternoon coaching her in the parking lot behind the church. When I failed a chemistry exam because I had spent the week doing inventory for a wedding order instead of studying, my mother told me that grades weren't as important as learning your place in this family. I didn't understand yet that my place meant the back office, forever. There is a particular kind of numbness that comes from being told, quietly and consistently, that your effort is expected and your sister's presence is a gift. I want to give you a few more scenes before that one, because the pattern only makes sense once you've seen it repeat. When I was 13, our town held an annual bake-off at the county fair, and I entered a lemon and thyme tart I had developed on my own over 3 weekends, testing the ratio of sugar to acid until it was exactly right. I won second place in my age group. My mother's first words when I ran to show her the ribbon were, "That's wonderful, sweetheart. Now go find your sister. She's been looking for you for 20 minutes to help her set up her dance recital chairs." I never got to hear anyone at that fair congratulate me a second time, because I spent the next 2 hours folding metal chairs into rows so Renata's recital could start on schedule. When I was 14, Renata borrowed my one good coat for a school trip and returned it 3 weeks later with a cigarette burn near the collar. When I asked my mother if Renata could replace it, she told me I was being materialistic and that sisters share. I noticed quietly that the sharing only ever moved in one direction. When I was 15, my father started paying me a flat $10 a shift to help in the kitchen on weekends, which felt like a fortune at the time, right up until I discovered, at 17, that Renata was being paid $20 for shifts she frequently didn't show up to. When I asked why, my father said, "Renata has more responsibility. She talks to the clients." I was the one who had prepped every dish those clients ate. I want to give you one more scene, because it's the one that explains everything that came after. I was 22, home from college for the summer, working full days in the kitchen to help cover a wedding season that had booked out further than we could staff. Renata was 24, living at home rent-free, working the front of house maybe 2 days a week between what she called networking lunches. One night, after a 16-hour day, I asked my father gently if I could be paid a proper wage instead of the flat stipend I'd been getting since I was 15. He looked at me like I had asked him to sell the building, Renata doesn't ask for more, he said. She understands what family means. I went back to school that fall and told myself I would leave the business behind for good once I graduated. I didn't. I came back 3 years later because my mother called me crying, saying the business was drowning in unpaid invoices and my father's blood pressure was through the roof, and she needed someone she could trust to fix it. Not Renata. Me. That was the first time I noticed something strange. Whenever the business was thriving and photogenic, it was Renata's business. Whenever the business was in trouble, it quietly became mine to save. I fixed it. I spent that first year rebuilding vendor relationships my sister had let lapse, because she found chasing people for money beneath her. I renegotiated our lease with the building's minority owner, a retired restaurateur named Walter Alderman, who had put up capital when my parents first expanded out of the garage. Walter and I got along in a way I never quite got along with my own family. He respected precision. He respected the fact that I showed up at 6 in the morning to receive deliveries and stayed until midnight balancing the books. Over the next several years, whenever Walter mentioned that he was thinking about retiring fully and cashing out his stake in the building's holding company, I asked him not to sell it to just anyone. I asked him to let me buy him out slowly, in pieces, as I could afford. Using my own savings, separate from any family money. He agreed quietly because he trusted me, and because he had watched my parents overlook me for over a decade and it bothered him more than it ever seemed to bother them. We structured it cleanly. I formed a private LLC in my name alone, Wren Hollow Holdings, and over 6 years I purchased Walter's shares of Whitfield Property Group, the entity that actually owned the building. Our restaurant and commissary kitchen operated inside of. My parents never asked who owned the building. They assumed, the way people assume things they've never had to think about, that it was simply the family's. It was not. By the time I turned 32, I held 51% of Whitfield Property Group. My parents held the remaining stake, unaware that the balance of power inside their own walls had shifted entirely, one quiet wire transfer at a time. I didn't do it to punish anyone. I did it because Walter was the first person outside my own family who ever told me my work had value, and I wanted to protect what I had built with my own hands, in case the day ever came when I needed to. Remember the exact conversation that started it? Sitting in Walter's small office above his old restaurant, the smell of coffee and old paper thick in the air. He slid a folder across his desk and said, "You know your parents have no idea what you're worth to that business, right? I've watched you turn a losing quarter into a profitable one 3 times now. That's not luck, Mara. That's skill nobody in your family bothers to name." I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing, the way I'd been trained to since I was 9 years old. He kept going anyway. I'm not getting any younger, and I'd rather sell my stake to someone who actually understands what they're buying than to a stranger who'll flip it in 5 years. Think about it. I thought about it for exactly 1 week before I called him back and said yes. We started small, 5% the first year, funded partly by a bonus my parents didn't know I'd negotiated directly with a corporate client I'd landed on my own. The second year, 8%. Funded by savings I built by living below my means in a small apartment above the hardware store on Fig Street, while my sister lived rent-free in our parents' guest house. I want to be honest with you about something, because this story isn't really about villains and heroes. It's about what happens when the truth finally gets to speak for itself. There were nights during those 6 years when I almost stopped. Nights when I told myself I was being paranoid. That surely my parents would never actually push me out after everything I'd done. That buying protection I might never need was a strange, cold way to live inside a family. Then I would remember the lemon tart, or the coat, or the $10. An hour, and I would keep going anyway. By the 4th year, I owned 31%, by the 5th, 44%. Walter and I signed the final transfer on a rainy Thursday in October in Priya's office, with none of the ceremony the moment probably deserved. He shook my hand, told me to take care of the old building, and said one more thing I've never forgotten. Your family is going to be upset when they find out you did this without telling them. Let them be upset. A family that has to be told the truth in a lawyer's office is a family that already stopped listening to you a long time ago. I didn't fully understand what he meant until the folder landed on the table in front of me 5 months later. That day came on a Tuesday in March. My mother called a family meeting, which was unusual because in 20 years my parents had never once asked my opinion about anything involving the business's future. I walked into that meeting expecting a conversation about summer staffing. Instead, my father slid a folder across the table and told me that they had decided, as a family, to transition full ownership and operational control of Whitfield and Daughters Catering to Renata. Effective in 90 days. I would remain, they said, in an advisory role, unpaid, for the good of the family, while Renata took the title of CEO. I sat there and did the math out loud in my head before I said a single word. 90 days. No severance, no equity, no acknowledgement of the 10 years I had spent rebuilding a company my sister had nearly run into the ground twice before I ever took over the books. I asked one question. Does Renata know how to read a profit and loss statement? My mother's face tightened. She has instincts, Mara. Some people have instincts. Not everyone needs a spreadsheet to lead. That was the moment. Not the folder, not the 90 days, not even the years before it. It was the phrase, "Not everyone needs a spreadsheet to lead," said to the one person in that family who had used spreadsheets to keep the lights on since she was 25 years old. Something in me went very still and very quiet, the way a room goes quiet right before a storm actually arrives. I did not argue, I did not cry, not there, not in front of them. I said, understood, folded the paper they'd handed me, and drove home. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with a legal pad and wrote down every single thing I actually knew that my parents did not. I owned 51% of the building. Had 6 years of clean financial records proving exactly who had kept this business solvent. And somewhere in the last 18 months, I had started noticing discrepancies in Renata's expense reports that I had quietly filed away instead of confronting. Because confronting Renata always cost me more than it cost her. Not anymore. The next morning, I called an attorney. Her name was Priya Kapoor, a business and estate attorney 2 towns over who had handled Walter Alderman's affairs for years and came recommended by him personally. I told her everything. The buyout structure, the LLC, the ownership percentage, the family meeting, the folder, the 90 days. Priya listened without interrupting the way good attorneys do, taking notes on a legal pad instead of a laptop. Because she said typing made people feel like they were being cross-examined. When I finished, she set her pen down and said, Mara, based on what you've just told me, your parents cannot legally transfer operational control of a business that operates inside a building it does not fully own without your consent, as majority holder of the property entity. I felt something in my chest loosen for the first time in months. They don't know that, I said. They will, she said. But we're going to make sure they find out on our terms, with documentation, not around a kitchen table. That was the difference between the years I had spent surviving my family and the months I was about to spend standing up to them. No shouting, no dramatic dinner table confrontation, documents, dates, signatures. Priya and I spent the next several weeks building a file so complete that no one in my family would be able to argue with it. Because arguing with facts is a very different thing from arguing with feelings, and feelings had never worked in my favor in that house. I pulled 6 years of Whitfield Property Group ownership records, each transfer notarized, each wire transfer documented, each amendment filed with the state. I pulled the original operating agreement Walter Alderman and my father had signed when the building was purchased. The one clause my father had apparently never reread, which stated that any change in the catering company's controlling management required written consent from a majority of the property entity's owners if the change would materially affect use of the premises. 51%. That was me. I compiled every profit and loss statement I had personally prepared for the last 6 years, alongside the 2 years before that, when Renata briefly held the title of operations lead and the company lost 11% of its annual revenue in 14 months. And then there were the expense reports. I want to be careful here, because I was not looking to destroy my sister. I was looking to protect myself, and the evidence simply existed, the way evidence does when you finally have a reason to look at it honestly instead of looking away. Over 18 months, Renata had submitted 11 reimbursement requests for client entertainment, totaling just under $23,000. Cross-reference the dates against our actual booked events. 6 of those 11 dates had no corresponding client on our calendar at all. I pulled the credit card statements, the same card my parents had handed her with no oversight because, as My mother once told me, trust is more important than a receipt. 3 of the client dinners were charged at a boutique in the next county that did not, as far as I could find, serve food. I sat with that discovery for a full evening before I did anything with it, because some part of me still wanted to find an innocent explanation, a receipt I'd misfiled, a client I didn't know about. I went back through 6 years of our shared calendar app, cross-referencing every name, every date, every venue, and I found nothing that explained the pattern away. I texted Renata once casually asking if she remembered which client the boutique dinner in February had been for, just to give her the chance to clear it up on her own. She replied 20 minutes later with a single line. Why does it matter? It's approved already. Don't make this weird. That was the moment I stopped giving her the benefit of the doubt, because an honest mistake explains itself, and a covered one gets defensive instead. I also pulled our building's keycard access logs going back 2 years, a system I had quietly installed after a string of small inventory losses none of us could ever fully explain. The logs showed Renata badging into the commissary kitchen after hours on 4 separate nights that didn't correspond to any booked event. Each visit under 20 minutes, each one followed within days by a discrepancy in our paper goods or liquor inventory. I didn't know yet exactly what that meant, and I didn't speculate out loud, not even to Priya. I simply added the access logs to the file, dated and time-stamped, and let the pattern speak for itself once the professionals reviewed it. I did not confront her. I forwarded the discrepancies to Priya, along with a forensic accountant she recommended named Elias Grant, who specialized in small business fraud, examinations, and had testified in 3 prior civil cases. Elias reviewed everything over 2 weeks and produced a formal report with dates, transaction IDs, and a plain language summary any judge, or any parent, could understand in under 5 minutes. While that was happening, I did something else. I changed nothing about my behavior at work. I still showed up at 6, I still ran payroll, confirmed vendor deliveries, and signed off on the following month's event calendar, because the business still had real employees who depended on real paychecks. And none of this was their fault. But I stopped covering for Renata. When she asked me to approve a rush reimbursement for a team-building retreat that had never appeared on any calendar I managed, I told her I needed documentation first. She looked at me like I had grown a second head. "Since when do you need documentation from me?" she said. "You've literally never asked before." "I'm asking now," I said, and left it there. She complained to our mother that same afternoon, and by dinner my mother called me to say I was being difficult and petty during an already stressful transition. I let her say it. I had learned, finally, that I did not have to defend a boundary to make it real. 3 weeks before the 90-day deadline my parents had given me, my father decided to throw a party. He called it a leadership transition celebration, inviting extended family, longtime clients, 2 local reporters who had covered us before, and every vendor who had worked with us for more than 5 years. Walter Alderman was invited too, out of old habit, though my father hadn't spoken to him in almost 2 years. I understood immediately what the party was for. It was not a celebration. It was a performance, staged for an audience, designed to make Renata's ascension feel inevitable and public before anyone could question it. My parents had done this before, in smaller ways, my whole life, announced the story before anyone could challenge the facts. This time, though, the facts belonged to me. Priya and I decided the party was exactly where this needed to happen, not because I wanted a spectacle, but because my parents had built one, and the truth deserved the same audience the fiction had been given. We did not plan a scene. We planned a delivery. 2 days before the party, Priya filed formal notice with the county recording office reasserting Whitfield Property Group's operating agreement terms, and sent certified letters to both my parents and Renata informing them, in plain legal language, that any transfer of Whitfield and Daughters Catering's operational control affecting use of the leased premises required written consent from the majority property owner. That was me. The letters arrived the morning of the party. I know because my mother called me at 9 a.m., her voice tight in a way I had never heard before. "What is this?" she said. "What is Whitfield Property Group? Why does it have your name on it?" "I'll explain everything tonight," I said. "At the party you already planned, since everyone will be there anyway. I want to pause here and tell you what I felt in that moment. because I think it matters more than what happened next. I did not feel triumphant. I felt calm, the specific kind of calm that comes only after you've done everything correctly, and there is nothing left to second guess. Every document was filed, every date was verified, every number had already been checked twice by someone with no emotional stake in my family at all. For the first time in my adult life, I was not walking into a room hoping to be believed. I was walking in with proof. The party was held in the same community hall where I had folded napkins into swans at 9 years old, which felt less like irony and more like the story finally closing a loop it had opened decades earlier. The room was full by 7. String lights, a dessert table I had personally designed the layout for, 40 or 50 guests, including 3 longtime clients whose weddings we had catered. Our accountant, 2 vendors, a local food writer named Colette who had covered us twice before, and Walter Alderman standing quietly near the back with a glass of sparkling water, watching the room the way a man watches something he built from a distance. My father gave a toast. He talked about legacy, about passing the torch, about how proud he was to watch the next generation of Whitfield women take the family business forward. Renata stood beside him in a pale green dress, glowing under the string lights, holding a glass of champagne she had not paid for. My mother caught my eye across the room once, a warning look, the same look she'd given me my entire childhood whenever she suspected I was about to embarrass the family by simply telling the truth. I smiled back. Then I walked to the small stage where the toast had just ended, and I asked if I could say a few words. My father hesitated, glancing at my mother, but there were 40 witnesses and 2 local reporters in the room, and refusing me publicly would have looked worse than letting me speak. "Of course," he said, forcing a smile. "Mara has been such a steady hand behind the scenes all these years. I want you to notice that phrase, behind the scenes." Even in that moment, even standing in front of me, he still couldn't say the words, "She ran this company." I stepped up, and I did not raise my voice, because I had learned finally that the loudest thing in any room is a fact nobody can argue with. 10 years ago, I said, I started keeping records for this business because nobody else was keeping them accurately. Tonight, I want to share a few of those records because I think everyone in this room deserves to understand what they're actually celebrating. I nodded to Priya, seated near the front, who handed out 1-page printed summaries to my parents, to Renata, and to our family accountant, while I put the same summary on the projector screen behind me, because sunlight and printed paper both have a way of making things undeniable at the same time. The first page showed 6 years of profit and loss statements under my management, alongside the 14 months under Renata's, side by side. Revenue up 31% under my oversight, revenue down 11% under hers. I heard a small gasp from someone near the dessert table. I kept my voice level. "This isn't about blame," I said. "It's about facts, and here's a fact none of you know yet. The building we're standing next to right now, the one this business operates out of, is owned by a company called Whitfield Property Group. As of 6 years ago, I hold 51% of that company." My mother's champagne glass made a small sound as she set it down too hard on the table beside her. "That means," I continued, "that any decision to transfer operational control of this business in a way that affects how this building is used legally requires my written consent. Consent I was never asked for. Consent I was never even told I had the right to give." Renata's face had gone pale under the string lights, the champagne flush draining out of it fast. "This is insane," she said, loud enough for half the room to hear. "You're doing this here? Now? In front of everyone?" "You did this here," I said, still calm, still quiet. "You and Mom and Dad chose this room, this audience, this celebration. I'm just the only one who came with proof instead of a toast." I put the second page on the screen. The forensic report, 11 reimbursement requests, 6 with no corresponding booked event, $23,000 in company funds, documented by transaction ID, by date, by the exact retail location the yerba charges had come from. I put the third page up next, the keycard access logs, 4 dates highlighted in yellow, each one lined up beside the corresponding inventory shortfall from our supplier records. I heard my father's chair scrape against the floor as he sat down heavily, the toast-giving posture gone out of him completely. "This is a private matter," my mother said, her voice pitched low and urgent, the voice she used when she wanted a room to forget what it had just heard. "This does not need to happen in front of our clients." "You invited the clients," I said. "I only brought the paperwork." I did not read every line out loud. I did not need to. I simply said, "I've asked our accountant to review the full report with you privately after tonight, because I think this conversation deserves to continue somewhere." Quieter than a celebration. The room had gone almost completely silent, the kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses against your ears. Colette, the food writer, was very carefully not looking at her notepad, which told me she was absolutely writing something down. One of our longtime clients, a soft-spoken woman named Bettina, who had booked us for both of her daughter's weddings, leaned toward the man beside her and whispered something I couldn't hear, though I saw her glance at the projector screen twice, reading the numbers over again, like she wanted to be sure she hadn't misread them. A vendor near the back, our floral supplier of 9 years, quietly took out his phone and photographed the screen before I even asked anyone to. I didn't stop him. The truth had never needed my permission to spread once it was finally out in the open. My father's face had gone the color of the tablecloth. He stepped toward the stage, voice low, urgent, meant only for me. "Mara, we can talk about this at home." "We could have," I said. "Any time in the last 10 years. You chose tonight. I'm simply finishing the conversation you started." Renata pushed past him toward the stage steps, champagne glass abandoned on a nearby table, her voice climbing toward the kind of performance she usually reserved for clients. "You've always been jealous of me," she said, loud enough that the string light seemed to flicker under the weight of it. "This whole thing, the building, the paperwork, it's not about the business, it's about you never being able to stand that people actually like me." I let the accusation sit in the air for a moment before I answered it, because I had learned that silence, held just long enough, does more work than a raised voice ever could. "I don't think this is about being liked." "Renata," I said, "I think it's about $23,000 charged to a boutique that doesn't serve food, and 4 unexplained badge-ins to a kitchen that wasn't hosting an event. I'm not angry that people like you. I'm asking you to explain the receipts." She didn't have an answer for that. Nobody in that room did. I looked out at the room, at 40 familiar faces, at clients who trusted us with their weddings and their funerals and their family reunions, at vendors who had extended us credit based on a reputation I had spent a decade protecting. "I'm not here to end this business," I said. "I built too much of it to want to see it fail. I'm here because I was told tonight, in this very room, that I would never measure up to my sister, on the same day I found out my sister had been quietly taking money from a company I own the building for. I think you all deserve to know both of those things happened on the same day." I stepped down from the stage. I did not wait for applause because this was never a performance for me the way it had been for them. It was simply the truth. Delivered once, clearly, with documents attached. The aftermath unfolded exactly the way facts tend to, once they're finally in the light instead of buried in a drawer. 2 of our longtime clients pulled Priya aside before the party even ended, quietly asking whether their upcoming bookings were still secure, and Priya assured them, calmly, that operations would continue without interruption, because the business itself remained intact. It was the ownership and the honesty around it that had changed, not the quality of the work. Walter Alderman found me near the coat rack as people began filing out, and he squeezed my shoulder once, the way he always did instead of saying something sentimental, and said only, "Took you long enough, kid. Proud of you." My mother did not speak to me for 6 days. When she finally called, it wasn't an apology. It was a demand that I fix this quietly before it damaged the family's reputation any further. I told her, gently but plainly, that the reputation had been damaged the moment they decided I could be erased from a business I had spent a decade saving, and that documentation doesn't create damage, it only reveals it. The formal fallout took about 6 weeks. Elias Grant's forensic report was shared with our business's insurance carrier and our accountant, and Renata was given the option, through Priya and a separate attorney my parents hired for her, to repay the $23,000 in full through a structured settlement rather than face a formal fraud complaint. She agreed. My parents, faced with the reality that they could not legally transfer operational control without my written consent, and faced with a forensic report that made continuing to publicly champion Renata as CEO material untenable, quietly walked back the 90-day plan. There was no dramatic reversal, no tearful family meeting where everyone hugged and healed. There was simply a new operating agreement drafted by Priya that formalized what should have been true for years. I became president and majority owner of Whitfield and Daughters Catering, Renata. Stepped back from any financial or signing authority entirely, and took a front-of-house coordinator role with clearly defined duties, clear boundaries, and no company card. My parents remained minority stakeholders with no operational authority, a title that finally matched the amount of actual oversight they had provided for the last decade. I changed the locks on the office that same month, not out of spite, but because a business with real financial controls needs real physical controls. And because it was the first door in my life I had ever had the legal right to lock on my own terms. I also replaced the after-hours keycard system entirely, restricting commissary access to scheduled events only, logged and reviewed weekly by our new office manager instead of trusted to memory and good faith. It wasn't about punishing anyone going forward. It was about making sure the business would never again depend on nobody noticing. The first payroll I ran as president, I sat alone in the office afterward and just looked at the confirmation screen for a long moment. Because it was the first time in 10 years that number had ever had my title attached to it, instead of quietly existing under someone else's name. I called Elias Grant a few weeks later, not for business, just to thank him, and he told me something I still think about. Most of the fraud I find isn't complicated, he said. It's just unexamined. People get away with things for years, not because they're clever, but because the people around them decided, a long time ago, not to look too closely. I told him my family had been deciding not to look too closely at me for over a decade, just in the opposite direction. He laughed, but not unkindly, and said that sounded like its own kind of fraud, the theft of being taken seriously. I hadn't had a name for it until then. The office is quieter now. I still arrive at 6 most mornings, but I no longer feel like I'm proving something to anyone in that building. I hired an office manager to help with the workload I used to carry alone in silence. Because I finally understood that doing everything myself had never been a virtue, it had simply been the price my family charged me for being taken seriously. My mother and I speak occasionally, carefully, about weather and invoices and nothing. That matters too much yet. My father has never said the word sorry, not directly, though he did tell me once, standing in the parking lot after a slow Tuesday shift, that the business runs better now, which from him is close enough to an apology that I've decided to accept it. Renata and I are still finding our way back to something that resembles a relationship, one boundary at a time, without a company card between us to complicate it. Think about that night at the community hall often, not because I enjoyed it, but because it taught me something I wish someone had told me at 9 years old, folding napkins into swans while my sister got the photograph. What I did was not revenge. Revenge would have meant destroying the business, humiliating my sister for its own sake, taking pleasure in the collapse of something my parents built. Didn't do that. I protected what I had earned using facts instead of feelings, and I let the consequences belong to the people who had actually created them. Self-respect doesn't need an audience, but sometimes it needs a record, dated and signed, so that no one can quietly rewrite the story afterward. I think that's the real difference between tearing a family apart and simply refusing to disappear inside one any longer. So here's my question for you, and I'd really like to hear your answer in the comments below. If you found out tonight that you actually held the one piece of leverage that could finally make your family see you clearly, would you use it quietly, the way I tried to at first? Or would you make sure the whole room heard it at once the way I ultimately had to? Thank you for watching this story all the way to the end. If it meant something to you, please like this video, subscribe for more stories like this one, and tell me in the comments what boundary you finally stopped apologizing for.